Hello, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. So, I'm still not entirely better as of yet. My throat is still a bit funny, but I am dedicated to actually make sure that I am here and recording for you guys so that way you have something to listen to. That being said, of course, I decided to do this on my next script, which just so happens to be one of the longer ones. Pray for me. Today I have a rough episode, and while I could have turned this into a 2 or 3-parter, I figured we could all suffer through it together in one information-packed episode. I will give trigger warnings for the extra horrifying details, but let's not procrastinate any further. This is what you should know about the Rockhampton Rapist. On the 27th of June, 1951, Leonard John Fraser was born to George and Agnes Fraser in Ingham, Queensland. He was the third-born child with 2 brothers and 2 sisters. His father was a Scottish World War II vet who had gone to work as a machinist. Due to his line of work, he did have to move around a lot, so growing up, Leonard really didn't get the chance to make any serious connections. In 1952, when Leonard was just 1 year old, the family suffered a serious loss when George had taken 2 of his sons with him to work to help out his wife. During this time at work, he was leveling ground in a forestry plantation with his 2 sons in the machine with him. As he was reversing up a hill, the tire slipped, causing it to shudder as it slid back down the hill. This caused his 3-year-old son to fall out of the machine and unfortunately went under the tires, killing him. This would understandably change the family dynamic. However, when asked about it himself, Leonard would change the story and had an obvious issue with pathological lying. Or in short, it depends on who asked him and on what day. In some instances, he would claim that his father would beat him severely for breaking any rules, and felt as though he was treated unfairly in comparison to his siblings. How true this really is, honestly, cannot really be confirmed. What can be confirmed, however, is that Leonard started his life of crime with theft. He would come home with various items that did not belong to him, such as toys and shoes. When his parents and siblings would ask him where he had got these items from, he would lie compulsively with ease. I am sure you can currently tell, Leonard was never really friends with the truth. This would extend throughout his whole life to the degree where it is believed that maybe he even believed his own lies. Throughout his childhood, especially at school, it was noted that Leonard suffered severe behavioral issues and would throw tantrums and disrupt the class when he would not get his way. Due to his constant moving, a lot of people who would encounter him would say he was seen as a loner, and due to that, he very obviously didn't have many friends. At the age of 14, Leonard left school and was then told by his parents that if he wasn't going to go to school, that he was going to have to find a way to contribute to the household. Half-heartedly, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps. He started to work towards getting his machinist license. However, he failed due to the lack of motivation to continue on. The following year, when he was 15, Leonard and his friends really fell into higher-end thefts, and this time, instead of it being shoes or toys, Leonard was caught stealing a gearbox from a car. With this, he eventually got caught by the police. This didn't help to curb his illicit actions, and he then started acting out more, refusing to listen to any authority figures. The pivotal point came from him stealing a motorcycle and threatening to rape a teenaged girl, and this landed him 2 years in a boys' home to correct his ever-worsening behavior. His parents were very loving still, and would visit him there every 2 weeks and bring him biscuits and his favourite soup. However, life in the boys' home was worse than his parents could have imagined. The older boys in the home would violently rape Leonard, who in anger would in turn violently rape boys younger than him. One form of discipline for the boys would be to be starved for days at a time. They were made to march everywhere they needed to go, and would witness animal abuse. This is not where you would want to send young boys to help reform them, and it comes as no surprise that a number of boys that attended this school, according to local officials, have wound up committing some of the country's most heinous crimes. And what was the name of this boys' home? I have absolutely no idea. Deep dive and Googling have not helped at all. In 1968, Leonard was 17 years old, and he was finally released from said boys' home. However, filled with rage and violence, he then went to go on to physically assault a train station attendant, was then arrested, and then sentenced to a further 2 years in the exact same boys' home that he had just been released from. I just have to wonder out loud for a moment, what the fuck? I get in the decades before there wasn't a lot of follow-up, and there were a lot of questionable decisions to say the least. But seriously, did no one stop to ask if he was just released and was capable of this after only originally making threats and stealing? Surely there was something wrong with that place. I don't know, my people. It was a messed up time for sure. After Leonard was able to leave the home the second time, he tried to gain work as a manual labourer, but continued to break the law. He would abuse substances and was caught in 1970 for driving without a licence, and then would become involved in street fights. In 1971, he stole a car, and this time he served 6 months in prison due to being too old to go back to the boys' home. I honestly wonder if prison felt safer than that place. After this, he would continue to move around Australia and commit petty crimes, but nothing too severe as of yet in this timeline. In 1972, Leonard had gained a position as a sitter for sex workers in King's Cross, Sydney. I assume that this means he would mainly keep an eye on the workers to ensure their safety, and that people weren't going to dip out without paying for services. I'm not sure though. If you happen to know, please fill me in. On one particular day in the position, Leonard had an argument with someone and went for a walk to blow off some steam. To that I say, good start on working on the anger management. Unfortunately, it didn't continue this way, as a French tourist approached him and asked for directions. Leonard pointed her in the right direction, but as she then was walking away, he grabbed her from behind, put his hand over her mouth, and punched her several times, and dragged her into some bushes where he then violently sexually assaulted her and stole $14 from her purse. Once he finished this horrific assault, he realized he was covered in her blood, and he had attacked her so viciously that blood spatter had been found on surrounding plants. Bad. Bad, Leonard. That is not how you deal with your anger. I say it like that matters. Spoiler alert, the human trash bag is dead. And to that I say, good. In his panic, this absolute monster with toenail clippings for brains fled, losing one of his thongs. Flip-flops for those of you who are not Australian. And also dropped a bloody handkerchief. This poor woman, who he had assaulted, lay unconscious for 30 minutes until someone found her. Her nose and cheekbone were broken. She was severely bruised all over, and the sexual assault had been so violent that she was not able to have any more children. 2 weeks later, Leonard was jailed over other charges of assault and armed robbery, where he was then jailed for 5 years, but only served 18 months before being let out on parole. Just 22 days. 22. After being released from prison, Leonard saw his next victim walking along St. Mary's Road. He grabbed her, twisted her arm behind her back, and dragged her off the road and raped her. To make this situation that much more scary, after he raped her, he forced her to stand up and walk with him while holding his hand. Leonard would later say that he believed that this woman enjoyed what he did to her. The fact he ever existed, honestly, his mother should have swallowed him. A week later, on the 17th of July, another woman had unfortunately caught his eye. Leonard came into the dry cleaning shop that she was working in and asked for his dry cleaning, which he actually did not have any there. He followed her into the back, where he then grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and forced her to the ground. However, this time a customer came in, and Leonard fled the store. Allegedly, Leonard returned a week later to try again, but once again with no luck. 3 days later, Leonard saw a woman in Rudy Hill. He approached her and then started to talk to her, when he then punched her in the face. She fell down a bank near a creek, and Leonard followed her down and started to tear off her clothes from her body, when she convinced him not to do it this way, and instead to take her back to his place, making him believe that she was okay and wanted this. Thankfully, being dumber than a pile of rocks, he agreed, and they started to walk towards his house. She ran to a random house to get help. He then panicked and fled the area. However, he dropped his wallet, which also contained his birth certificate. Hallelujah! he is dumb enough not only to carry his birth certificate with him, but to also drop his wallet, which contained said birth certificate. He was then arrested, where he then confessed to all the assaults he had committed, including the one of the French tourist. With this, he was then sentenced to 21 years in jail for rape, assault, and intent to commit rape. He was then made to have a psychiatric assessment, where they diagnosed him with psychopathy. So, no remorse for his actions, no impulse control, and an easy willingness to use people to get what he wants, which so far in this episode, it has been strongly reflected. But alas, that is not all there is. Like a late night infomercial, I will now say the famous catchline. But wait, there's more. No free steak knives though. I'm not that rich. He only served 7 years for his sentence before being paroled. How that actually happened is beyond me. But if he was forced into his full sentence, lives could have been spared. In 1982, his grandparents died in a tragic car accident, and as Leonard was very close to his grandmother, he ended up taking his rage out on another young woman. He noticed a car in a backyard of a home and approached the woman who was living there to ask if she would be willing to sell it to him. He lied, saying that he knew her husband. Her dog started barking, and the second she turned around to shush them, he put his hand over her mouth, grabbed her, forced her down the hallway of her own home. She was both lucky, but really not at the same time, as he reportedly told her that he was not going to hurt her and just wanted to prove a point. This poor woman was terrified, and working under the assumption that this man knew her husband, she begged him to call him. Leonard called this woman's husband and said, "I hope you're not going to kill me. I just wanted to prove a point that someone could break in and rape your missus." After this, Leonard fled the scene and was later arrested at a nearby caravan park. He was then sentenced to 2 months in prison for aggravated assault. To which I really do have to wonder, were they not able to keep track of what he had done previously? Like, I get he didn't sexually assault this woman, thankfully, but he has a proven history of following through. And he was out on parole, so why not just put him back and throw away the key? After being released, he moved into the caravan park with his parents, where he met Pearl Rigby, a 26-year-old single mother. This started a 3-year relationship where Leonard calmed down and ceased his criminal activity and gained employment as a full-time Queensland railings ganger. He made friends at work, and they nicknamed him Animal for his partying. He and Pearl had a daughter and moved into a 2-bedroom flat. Pearl had no idea that Leonard had a criminal history and claimed that the relationship had been relatively normal, with a normal sex life. However, she said that he was a compulsive liar and continued to lie throughout their relationship, and she does believe he cheated on her throughout their relationship. The next action of note was in 1985 when Leonard stalked a young woman on a beach. He had been watching her for days without her knowing and finally followed her along the beach. She became aware of him while collecting driftwood as he moved towards her. She stated she didn't need help carrying it, as she believed he was about to offer to help. However, he put his hand over her mouth, marched her up the beach, and into some bushes. She pleaded with him not to take her in there, and instead to take her home. But due to his previous experience, he wasn't going to take any risks. He then proceeded to sexually assault her, both orally and vaginally. Once he was done, he forced her to stay put as he fled. After a time, the woman went to wash herself off in the sea and waited a while longer before heading home, as she was scared of him watching her. But Leonard had gone to a friend's home nearby to create an alibi. The woman bravely went to the police about the attack with a friend. I don't think people understand how scary and traumatic reporting sexual assault is, especially directly after, because all you want to do is to go home where you feel safe, and to shower, and to just be left alone. But instead you end up facing down a detective who demands answers as if you've been the one to do something wrong. But she was brave and she did, and the police investigated the area and door knocked as they came across a farmer who mentioned a man who had been trespassing and said his name was Fraser and was looking for work. The police searched the database for the name they were given, and the only person to come up was Leonard Fraser. They showed the woman the picture of him, and she freaked out and tearfully stated that it was him. There was enough evidence present to charge Leonard, and he was put on trial, where he was sentenced to 12 years. With all this information so far, I would like to point out that we aren't even up to what he's infamous for. This has all been a prelude, and honestly, I can't help but feel that maybe, if this had all been taken more seriously, as I keep saying, there wouldn't have been more. Now, Leonard did continue to apply for parole, but due to his anger issues and continually failing psych tests, he was deemed untreatable and at high risk of reoffending. But sadly, that wouldn't be enough, because they were right. He was untreatable, and he did go on to reoffend. 12 years later, in 1997, he was released from prison. However, his wife had split from him, and his family wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. So where would he go? Well, he went to stay with a pen pal he had from prison, Marie Chivers. Her family really didn't want her to write to inmates, and really did not want her to allow one to move in with her. But she thought she saw the best in Leonard, and he likely saw her as easy and vulnerable. Straight after moving in with her, he was physically and sexually abusive towards her. At one point, Marie went to visit her mother and had visible bruises on her. Her mother knew who was to blame for this, and when she saw him at a supermarket, she confronted him. He allegedly said to her that if they hadn't been standing in the street, he would have slit her throat. This wasn't an empty threat, and she knew it. Now, the issue was Marie was sick. She was so sick that her cancer was diagnosed as terminal, and she had been admitted into a Brisbane hospital. And Leonard was absolutely furious about this, as she would not be coming back to Yeppoon. He then travelled to the hospital, where he then walked her into the hospital chapel, where he initially tried to convince her to go back with him. When she said no, he locked her in the chapel and violently raped her. He then tried to gaslight her by saying he was showing her love and that it wasn't rape. 6 months later, Marie passed away from cancer, and in her last days, she finally told her mother about it, but hadn't told anybody else. I honestly can't even begin to imagine how it would have felt to be fighting for your life, and then to literally have to fight for your life against someone who claimed to love you. As I said with the spoiler alert, I'm glad he's dead. By this point, Leonard was long gone. He eventually moved to Mount Morgan, where he would drug and rape up to 16 confirmed women. But it could have been more. Some of these women were intellectually disabled, so he was also preying on those who were vulnerable. He would also stand out the front of the school and coax young girls into his home with the promise of weed and alcohol. There is no doubt that he also sexually abused these children. He later befriended a single mother of 3, who eventually trusted him enough to allow him to babysit her children. That night, while the other 2 were preoccupied, he asked the 10-year-old girl to walk with him to his home to get some money so he could buy them all dinner. On this walk, he was smoking weed and told the little girl to try some. She claimed it made her feel dizzy. Once they got to his home, he took her into his bedroom, where he then proceeded to sexually assault her. She was threatened with death if she told the police. Eventually, the residents of the town he was living in ran him out, wanting to protect their families. He only lived there for 11 months. 11 months and over 16 confirmed cases of sexual assault. After being run out of town, Leonard returned to his hometown of Rockhampton, where in 1998, women started disappearing, starting with Natasha Ryan, who disappeared in August after her mother dropped her off at school. Hopes of finding her alive diminished rapidly due to her young age, and police assumed she had been murdered by Leonard Fraser, who was initially charged with her murder. In the month before she went missing, Natasha had already run away from home once, aided by her boyfriend, 22-year-old Scott Black. She was found 2 days after that attempt. Scott went to court in November of 1999, where he pleaded guilty to willful obstruction of police after he told the officers he did not know where she was. But after she could not be located when she went missing the second time, Natasha's family eventually came to believe that she was dead and held a memorial service in Bundaberg, Queensland, on her 17th birthday in 2001. It would be 4 years until her family found out what had happened to her, but I will circle back around to that, as I don't want to give it away just yet. Leonard then started a relationship with an intellectually disabled woman known as Chrissy, where he would continually abuse her without regard for who knew it. Even at one point, the police were called and he told the police that if a woman was disobeying her male partner, they deserved to be punished. This is honestly horrifying. I know he's a psychopath, but how can anybody be that way? It is honestly something I still cannot honestly comprehend. Now, trigger warning for animal abuse. So I will just get it all out of the way as quickly as possible if you want to skip ahead once, maybe twice. Chrissy had 2 6-week-old kittens who wasn't allowed to have them in the flat they lived in, so Leonard killed them. And then the housemate they had one day went outside around midnight and found Leonard engaging in bestiality with Chrissy's pet dog. When the housemates saw that, her and her partner kicked Leonard out of the house immediately. When he later came back, he had poisoned the dog with rat poison, who later died from this. Chrissy soon moved out shortly after and continued living with Leonard. I would like to highlight, throughout his life and throughout the remainder of his life out of prison, he was raping and abusing countless women and children. 39-year-old Julie Turner was killed early in the morning on Monday the 28th of December 1998 on her way home from the Airport Liberties nightclub after a long night of drinking by herself. She had been having a hard time, and just prior to Christmas, her and her boyfriend had a vicious argument. Julie had no idea that on her way home that Leonard had been watching her, and the big twist to this is that she knew him from work. He had befriended Julie and had been a shoulder to cry on while dealing with domestic violence in her relationship. He had even offered her to allow her to move in with him, but had warned that he lived with his sister, who was, and I quote what he said, retarded. This sister was in fact his live-in girlfriend, Chrissy. That night, Leonard ran up behind, barefoot, and grabbed her, punching her so hard that it broke her neck. He then laid her on the grass alongside the road, undressed her, strangled her to death, and then raped her corpse. He then hid the body in a nearby bush, went home, showered before returning to the scene of the crime to move the body. As he was then loading her body into the boot of his car, there was a police car across the road looking into a smashed window. Like, the police were right there and they missed it. Not their fault. They were focusing on a job that they were genuinely called to. But they were right there. He then drove out to Kinka Beach, where there had been a lot of abandoned cars, carried her body out to a section of thick bush and laid her there, only to then go back to Rockhampton and casually do his food shopping. He wouldn't just leave her body alone, however. After a time of serious decomposition, he returned and pulled her head off of her body. But it wasn't the full head. The bottom jaw remained attached to the body. Julie's skeletal remains, skull missing, were found on the 21st of December 2001, so it would take 2 years for her body to be found. She was reported missing 4 days after her death when her partner could not find her. And of course, due to the domestic violence situation, he was the top suspect for a long time. Shortly after Julie's murder, Leonard moved his sights to someone he had known for a few years, 36-year-old Beverly Lego. Beverly had had a bit of a rough start, and she was divorced by her mid-20s. It was shortly after her divorce that she had been given really exciting news, as she had applied for a modelling job where she was successful and was flown to Singapore to walk the catwalk. This should have been her moment to bounce back, her comeback story. However, her family became concerned for her safety when she stopped calling home until one day they received a call from the police saying that she had been detained for illegally trying to board a plane. What had happened with this modelling job was that it was a scam and she was put into sex slavery and drug trafficking. She only got away because she was smart enough to save the drugs she'd been given rather than taking them and made a run for it to the airport. So really, it had gone from bad to worse. When she arrived home, she was nothing but skin and bone. She did recover, however, and she managed to get past the addiction that was forced upon her. Unfortunately, this had triggered an underlying diagnosis of schizophrenia to surface. She was able to live alone, but she was also extremely vulnerable, making her Leonard's type. In February of 1999, she bumped into a familiar Leonard, who invited her back to his home for coffee, starting up a fatal friendship. In March of that year, Leonard was driving with Beverly in the car. He put his hand on her leg, and she rejected his attempt. Not one to take no for an answer, while still driving, Leonard punched Beverly in the face, and she slumped, started gurgling and convulsing. Realizing that she was having a fit and suffocating due to this, he drove off to a more remote area, took her out of the car, and placed her under some mango trees. He was certain that she was already dead at this point, but to be sure, he undressed her and tied her underpants around her neck so tightly that if she wasn't already dead, that she would suffocate. He then, in traditional form for himself, raped her corpse and then left her body to rot. Beverly's landlord reported her missing, and her ex, who had a violent history, was considered a suspect. On the 10th of April, 1999, Leonard took friend Elizabeth Green and her 13-year-old daughter to Nankin Creek for a swim, to an area less than 20 meters from where Beverly's remains were found. While they were at the creek, he walked off alone for some time in the direction of where the remains were later found. This wouldn't be until December of 2000. In January of 1999, Leonard met Sylvia Benedetti at Centrelink. For those of you who are not in the know, it is the Australian welfare support. Centrelink is one of Leonard's favourite hunting spots due to the sheer volume of vulnerable people, and 19-year-old Sylvia was one of them. She had a rough childhood, having been sexually abused by her father. While her mother believed her and took appropriate action, the damage had already been done, and Sylvia was suffering with severe trauma. Since their first meeting, she and Leonard would hang out every so often, and one day he told her that he used a room at the Queenslander Hotel in Rockhampton. The hotel was abandoned, so it was a great place for hiding illicit substances. That night on the 18th, she went with him to get drugs. He broke in and navigated their way to a room. Once entering this room, he tried to kiss her. Keep in mind with what he did next. She was only 19, and he was in his late 40s. In response to Leonard trying to kiss her, she attempted to punch him. This then angered him, and he punched her, grabbed a plank of wood, and used it to cave in her skull. Her blood covered the walls and ceiling with how hard he was striking her. And once he was confident she was dead, he undressed and raped her, and then moved her body into the next room. He then tried to clean the blood from the walls with a towel, but soon realized it was too much, and stuffed the bloody towels in a hole in the wall. He then moved Sylvia's body downstairs, where he propped her up against the toilet. Due to her violent death, there was blood everywhere. He then took her clothing and items and stored them in an old chest freezer that was filled with stagnant and disgusting water. A few days later, he found out that this hotel was set to be demolished. He became mad about this and then returned to take Sylvia's body, where he then dumped it at Sandy Point. She wouldn't be discovered until mid-January of 2001. 3 days later, still wanting more, Leonard started looking for his next victim, which would be his final. This would be 9-year-old Kira Steinhardt. The first time he saw her, he just watched her as she walked home from school. The day after, 10 days after her 9th birthday, she walked to school. Leonard made sure he was nearby the school when it let out and followed her as she took a shortcut through bushland. So here is a big old trigger warning, because I am going to outline what this monster did to this literal child. So if you are not comfortable, maybe skip a few minutes, or you can stop this episode. I honestly will not blame you. To be honest, as I said at the beginning, this is a very rough episode. She was struck from behind by Leonard with such force that it fractured her skull. He then continued to beat her to the point where she was bloody and had lost 2 teeth. After this, he undressed and raped her, and then shortly after, he slit her throat. The horrifying part to this was not what he did to her, necessarily. Don't get me wrong, it's horrifying. But what is more horrifying is that there was a family across the road from this scrubland that was sitting on their veranda watching as this all took place. They just sat there and watched as a 9-year-old girl was brutally attacked and raped. They did nothing, and I genuinely hope they are haunted by this forever. Leonard disposed of his shirt, Kira's bag and shoes, and moved her little body to some bushes, where he then left her. Leonard then returned with his car, placed her body in the boot. Leonard then returned with his car and placed her tiny body in the boot of his car. This family just watched as all of this happened, and they did nothing as they watched him drive away. I say that, but the mother, then an hour after Leonard drove away, called the police anonymously because she didn't want to get involved and was currently suffering from Ross River virus, and her husband was disabled. Fine, they couldn't do much, but they left it until the killer moved the body, which is an absolute disgrace. Since all this happened, she couldn't understand why when people found out that her family did nothing, they were so mad, and has since said she now would think twice about ever calling the police. Maybe people should feel the same way about ever helping them if that's the situation. Like, I'm mad. Like, eternally mad at this. But, moving on from this rage, because at the end of the day, their biggest sin was being complacent, and we are meant to be more mad at Leonard Fraser. We shall move on. Police found evidence of Kira's belongings and blood, but also Leonard's footprints. His footprints were unique, as his little toe didn't quite touch the ground, making his footprints look like it was missing. Leonard went to pick up Chrissy, with Kira still in the boot, drove out to the bush, and told Chrissy to keep her eyes forward. The sun was hurting her eyes, so she looked to the side and saw Leonard with Kira's body. He dropped her body, walked over and punched Chrissy in the face, telling her not to look and never to say anything about what she just saw. Kira's disappearance gained national attention, and just by luck, a police guard who was picking up his children had seen Leonard in the area. This police guard recognized him and knew him from his previous crimes. He saw the description on the news and called the police with the name of Leonard Fraser. When the police caught up with him shortly after, they advised him they were following up on a missing child, and Leonard absolutely lost it, saying that he was not a pedophile. Both his car and his flat were titled crime scenes and were searched. In the flat they found children's books, books on sex, torture and murder, as well as books that had belonged to children that he had previously molested. Due to the sheer volume of children's belongings, I really do wonder if there are a lot more victims that we just don't know about and likely won't ever find out about. There were bags of women's shoes and underwear that did not belong to his live-in girlfriend. But the one thing they found that really did just make my stomach drop was a bag containing 3 crudely cut human hair ponytails, one of which contained deceased lice. So when he tried to put forward the story of buying these from a wig store, it was not accepted. Leonard was taken into custody. A previous cellmate of Leonard offered to wear a wire and sit in a cell with him to see if they could fish any information out of him. After 29 hours of nothing, when this man was pretend released on bail, Leonard asked him to find an old flip knife that he had hidden in a peg basket at his flat, because it could link him to a robbery. Once police had this flip knife, they were able to find blood on it from Kira. During the search of Leonard's car, there was blood just about everywhere, even with his poor attempt at cleaning. After they confronted him with DNA evidence in his car, he admitted to killing her, but claimed he doesn't remember doing it. But, in stark contrast, offered to take them to her body. On the 6th of May, he stuck to his word and took them to her. The The day after he was charged with the death of Kira, they now strongly believed that he was the serial killer who may be responsible for the disappearances of Natasha Ryan, Julie Turner, Beverly Lego, and Sylvia Benedetti. Police searched for connecting information between these women and Leonard, and there were strong connections between all 4 women. An inmate simply known as Quinn relayed back anything that Leonard told him, including how he would gloat about all 4 women. This helped greatly in convicting him successfully for 3 consecutive life sentences. And on the 11th of April 2003, during his murder trial in Brisbane, police prosecutor Paul Rutledge informed the court that he was not guilty of the murder of Natasha Ryan. Natasha's father, Robert Ryan, said he almost collapsed when Rutledge made the announcement. The police had raided a house in North Rockhampton on the night of the 10th of April 2003. After the tip-off and had found Natasha alive, hiding in a bedroom cupboard, it was discovered that she had been living with Scott Black since disappearing on the 31st of August 1998. So while so many lives were taken and ruined by this monster, I felt it would be nice to at least let you know that at least one woman had not fallen victim to him. And in other amazingly fabulous news, which really isn't news because I've mentioned it a few times, on the 1st of January 2007, Leonard died in his sleep in the secure unit of the Princess Alexandra Hospital. Still too good for him, but I'm sure that he is in hell, rotting, potentially reliving his days being abused by the older children at the boys' home. And on that exhausted note, that is all I have for you this week. I know it was a long one, but I figured it was such a horrid case that it would be best to just rip the band-aid off and get it done. But as always, I will be posting pictures in regards to this case on Facebook and Instagram at What You Should Know Australia. If you have your own Australian crime or ghost stories, or you have a request, please send them to my email of whatyousshouldknow@gmail.com. Feel free to follow me on Twitter for updates at WhiskerPod. But until next week, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!